Hi, and welcome to The PH. I'm your host, Donnell Christian. On today's episode, we'll be talking about mental health within the context of COVID-19. But first, let's define mental health and a few other terms that will come up during the show. Today we're talking about mental illness, and we thought we should frame the discussion by quickly defining two important terms. The Mayo Clinic defines mental illness as a wide range of mental health conditions, disorders that affect your mood, thinking, and behavior. Examples of mental illness include depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, eating disorders, and addictive behaviors. Another term we're going to talk about is life course approach. The World Health Organization explains that this approach aims to increase the effectiveness of interventions throughout a person's life. It focuses on a healthy start to life and targets the needs of people at critical periods throughout their lifetime. This approach to public health matters, such as mental illness, promotes timely investments with a high rate of return for public health and the economy by addressing the causes, not the consequences of ill health. Mental illness is experienced by many worldwide. Unlike physical illnesses that can usually be seen, deteriorating mental health is often hidden and ignored, sometimes because of the demands of modern life. Culture, fear of losing economic self-sufficiency, and other reasons force persons to hide their mental illnesses, self-medicate, or ignore symptoms until they reach their breaking point. Our mental health is deeply connected to our social, economic, and physical environments, and social inequalities often increase the risk of many common mental disorders. These facts are reflected in Jamaica. According to the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, it is estimated that more than 3% of Jamaicans suffer from depression. Women have higher rates of depression and anxiety than men. Approximately 4% of Jamaicans suffer from anxiety, which is common among working-age Jamaicans. Psychosis was responsible for over 100,000 visits to clinics in 2016, accounting for more than 80% of mental illness-related clinic visits.
So the statistics really speak to me about the fact that mental ill health is real. And from my understanding, the Jamaican statistics are a little bit lower than the global stats for anxiety and depression. And so that tells me that it's likely that there are elements of underreporting and underdiagnosis. And I think some of this stems, unfortunately, from issues of stigma that's still associated with mental ill health, and some persons not having the psychoeducation that they need to become aware that this cluster of symptoms really speaks to this particular clinical disorder or another. To me, it is indispensable. It is a human right. It is so crucial to productivity and overall well-being to have access to mental health support services. I believe that so many of the issues that we face, separate and apart from health, but in terms of the interpersonal relationships that we have, in terms of productivity as a nation, and definitely physical health and mental health issues, all of these are affected by people's access to mental health support. So there is no way in my mind for us to, be the place of choice to work and live and do business if it is that we don't have access to this crucial piece of resources, which is mental health support. Especially during COVID, I believe that mental health support services for businesses is also crucial, because the fact of the matter is that we bring our whole selves into every space that we occupy. And so there has been this thinking that when we go to work, we are ideally supposed to take off the personal elements, we're supposed to take off the emotional, and all of them combine to produce the whole person. All of them impact on our well-being, they impact on our identity, they impact on our sense of agency, whether we think we can or not. And definitely all of those things impact how we relate to our colleagues and customers. And these also impact on productivity, which also lends to the bottom line. And so it's a whole line of connectedness that, that speaks to the importance of mental health and well-being, and definitely dedicated services, programs, products for business persons, business owners to implement within their own companies. one, address the issues. Sometimes it can go a long way just for staff, just for the team to hear from leadership, for example, that we know that this is a hard time. Just to humanize and normalize the fact that many of us are not okay. Because sometimes not being okay can be framed in a way that can be harmful to persons who are working. It can sound like you're not doing well. It can sound like you're underperforming. And it can really raise issues of inadequacy in many people. So it's important for there to be a clear-cut messaging, a communication machinery that says it's a very strange time. Things are very different, and we are aware, and we are empathizing with each other, and we're creating space for people to say, I'm not okay today. That's one. Just a general messaging of normalizing the fact that things are so different. Secondly, I would say planning needs to go into and execution needs to take place as it relates to programs, sessions, access to mental health support. So there are many companies that have employee assistance programs. So they may have external vendors who provide counseling and group support. This needs to be on every business owner and every corporation leader's checklist right now, so that persons can know that if you need additional support, which I think many people do, then you can access it. And as much as possible, let the barriers be low, right? So if it is that it's normally a bureaucratic process, how can we make this more accessible to all staff without any tiers of, seniority? Everyone needs to have access to this type of support. Another thing that I would recommend is having smaller, maybe department-focused sessions so that people can raise issues specific to the team, specific to targets and demands and how the programs are shifting or not. Because sometimes well-being is taken as, as a monolith, like everybody is supposed to just take care of their own well-being. And well-being looks like this. When for some people, what could be affecting their well-being is the fact that perhaps the way the team is functioning, the way leadership is requiring, demanding things is not affecting me in a positive way. And I think the fourth thing I would want to add is, to whatever extent is possible, arrange for flexibility in terms of how people carry out their jobs.
Globally, we see similar trends. The WHO says that over 264 million people suffer from depression, and over 45 million people worldwide have bipolar disorder. So, what is the current framework to help persons who are struggling with mental disorders? According to the WHO, health systems have not yet adequately responded to the burden of mental disorders. As a consequence, the gap between the need for treatment and its provision is wide all over the world. In low and middle income countries, between 76% and 85% of people with mental disorders receive no treatment for their disorder. A further compounding problem is the poor quality of care for many of those who receive treatment. A joint WHO report on the social determinants of mental health noted certain population subgroups are at higher risk of mental disorders because of greater exposure and vulnerability to unfavorable social, economic, and environmental circumstances interrelated with gender. Disadvantage starts before birth and accumulates throughout life. So, what are the improvements that need to be made? An equitable system is needed to allow persons from all economic and social classes to have access to mental health care and professionals. The availability of trained professionals is also a challenge that must be addressed. There are more than 140 practicing psychologists, psychiatrists, and counselors in Jamaica. But is this enough to support the population? So how can we make these changes happen? We know what needs to be transformed, but for this to occur, investment into mental health care is needed. The Jamaican government has ramped up mental health activities to mitigate any potential fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to building on its current mental health program, the Ministry of Health and Wellness launched its COVID-19 Mental Health Response Program in 2020, which provides community-based support and ease of access to mental health services. But further investment into mental health can provide transformative benefits for Jamaica. PAHO says it would improve health and restore over 75,000 healthy life years to the Jamaican population. provide economic benefits of over 60 billion Jamaican dollars, lead to large economic productivity gains and social benefits, and have a higher return on investment. For example, for every Jamaican dollar invested in clinical treatments for anxiety, Jamaica can expect a 5.5 Jamaican dollars in return. Now, let's hear from our expert in the interview segment. We're joined by Head of the Counselling Service at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Dr. Debbie Ann Chambers. It's a pleasure to have you on the show, Dr. Chambers, especially to discuss this very important issue. What are some social or risk factors that influence mental disorders in Jamaica?
I'm glad that you used the word social factors. There are many social factors. One that comes to mind is adverse childhood experiences. We are finding in the research that adverse childhood experiences increase the likelihood for various mental illness and also physical illness. What do I mean by ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences? These are the experiences of physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, household dysfunction, which may include domestic violence, incarceration of a member of the household, parental separation, history of substance abuse by persons in the household, etc. And these predispose persons to the development of depression, anxiety, PTSD, complex PTSD, and so on. Poverty is most definitely a risk factor, and this should be a concern to Jamaicans. When you are in a situation of poverty, especially urban poverty, you're more likely to face inequities in the health system. You're more likely to be exposed, again, especially in urban poverty, to violence, which increases the likelihood of developing various trauma disorders and substance abuse related disorders as people struggle to cope with the violence around them. Hereditary issues are ones that doctors and psychologists like to ask about a lot. So family history of mental illness. Also attachment issues, which I mentioned briefly when talking about adverse childhood experiences, but the more likely you are to have what we call insecure attachment, which is difficulty in your relationship with primary caregivers, where you may have been neglected or experienced various forms of abuse. You are more likely to develop what we consider personality disorders or personality wounds, I like to call them, various depressions, shame-related issues, and so on.
Explain how a life stages approach can help to improve population mental health.
So a life stages approach may be controversial in some ways. Some of the life stages models, feminists, cultural therapists, psychologists, etc., believe are normed on more white middle class populations. And so extrapolating them to a population like Jamaica can be difficult. So that's one of the disadvantages. But one of the advantages is that it gives us a general idea of some of the life tasks that our population faces. So if you look at adolescence, for example, and life stages approaches often cite the importance of identity formation. So if we know that our adolescents seek to develop their identities, to be close to peers, etc., but they don't have adaptive ways to do so, they will develop what we call maladaptive ways. And so we see a lot of young adolescents in gangs, etc. Rex Nesaford, he popularized the term smaddification. And so the idea is that we all look for be some smaddy, right? And if you don't be a smaddy by turning doctor, lawyer, nurse, whatever, you might try become a smaddy by turning gunman, etc. So if we understand that underlying that is a thrust for identity and connection and a thrust to be seen as somebody, then we can develop more adaptive ways that we can help adolescents be somebody in life.
Why is it important to help protect our children's mental health from a very early stage?
Yes, for sure. Many of the, what would I call it, successful interventions. For example, Carrie Mensa has a Dreamer World project that looks at childhood. because the more you face risk factors in childhood, the more likely you are to develop mental illness later as an adult. Early childhood through to adolescence, these are formative stages. The brain is still developing, or understanding of self is still developing. So it's an area and a stage of life where we can make a big impact on development, whether positively or negatively.
In a PAHO UNDP document, the 2017 Global Burden of Disease database shows that depression and anxiety disorders are among the most common mental health concerns facing the population of Jamaica. Around 3% of Jamaicans have a depressive disorder, and 4.1% have an anxiety disorder. Women are at a disproportionate risk for both disorders. Dr. Chambers, why do you think this is the case?
Well, if you look at what's going on in our world, if you're not feeling depressed and anxious, somehow, it's questionable, right? So there are lots of issues going on. When you look at Jamaica, you're looking at violence, poverty, inequity as some of the more damaging issues that we face. And so this is most definitely going to elevate stress levels. Chronic stress is not good for our mental health. It's not good for the body. So it releases certain stress hormones in the body, which will begin to break the body down after a while. It will look like anxiety, hypervigilance, down mood, lack of motivation, etc., which we like to diagnose as depression and so on, right? So this is very important. However, I want to point out to you that there are other studies. So Professor Freddie Hickling, for example, some time ago, looked at the prevalence of mental illness in Jamaica and found that personality disorders were quite high. And he estimated that approximately 1 million Jamaicans suffer with personality disorders.
Wow.
So we can look at things like antisocial personality, narcissistic personality. Basically, he looked at this as struggles with power management issues, dependency issues, and psychosexual issues. So now if you look at what's going on in Jamaica with the high crime rates, the high accident rates, the indiscipline on the roads, we feel that many Jamaicans are struggling in one way or the other, and there are many systemic reasons for that and many legacies that point towards that. So actually, worldwide, so not only in Jamaica, there is a understanding that women tend to be more at risk for depression and anxiety, and there are many theories for that. So one theory, for example, for those who are into masculine studies, is that the way that we measure depression and anxiety, which is more looking at internalizing issues, so this is sadness, lack of motivation, crying. That's not how men show depression. So men's depression, it is believed by some, are not identified so easily. So some really question the prevalence. So that's one theory. Another theory, which is more a social theory, is that women deal with all forms of gender-based violence, the feminization of poverty, and so are at risk for a myriad of social problems, which are likely to lead to depression and anxiety. And then a third theory, just to let you know briefly, are hormonal issues. So around the time of menopause, for example, women are at risk for depression and anxiety. Childbirth, so after giving a child, women may be more at risk for postpartum depression and anxiety, and around women's periods or menstruations. So there are various theories for why this might be so.
Has there been an increase in the number of patients with mental health disorders or stress-related issues during the pandemic?
Yes, so many articles point to that again, because of the high stress, because of the grief, the amount of people who have been ill and who have died worldwide. In Jamaica, we may not have that amount of deaths, but we do. We are not with our usual mourning rituals and the social support around time of death, etc. So that's leading to all sorts of complications.
Right.
And I could go on, but in my practice, I'm seeing people having quite a bit of stress. We're all exhausted. Myself, I'm exhausted. So, so yes, people are more at risk.
How can we identify when we or our dependents, relatives, or friends need professional help?
Okay, so if you're finding yourself not able to function in the way that you're used to. So one way of defining mental illness is that it affects our social and occupational functioning. So our ability to function in our social life and in our work life. So if you're finding that you're down to the point where you're missing days from work, whether it's virtually or not, you're finding yourself with so much anxiety that you're not able to stay at work, you're hypervigilant, so watching out for people coughing, sneezing to the point that you can't function, to the point where you're no longer relating to others. So this is during the pandemic, but in general also, if you're finding yourself smoking a bit more ganja, drinking some more alcohol, if you're finding yourself having thoughts of wanting to die, or you're starting to fantasize about methods of suicide or planning for suicide, anything like that that is getting in the way of your functioning, it is time to seek out a professional if one is available to you.
Dr. Chambers, what are some tips for coping with stress during the pandemic?
I think two very important factors are social support and physical activity. And those two factors actually have been found to help with mitigating the development of various mental illness. Now, some people will say, well, I don't have anybody to talk to. There's nobody I trust. But if you can find even one person on whom you can rely, it doesn't mean that you pour out your whole life to that person, but you can socialize, laugh with the person, etc. People who distract you, make you laugh, becoming involved even in religious organizations, that's very popular in Jamaica, in committees, etc. as you are able, that will buffer your social support. Physical activity releases all sorts of feel-good chemicals in your body and mitigate against the stress hormones. So that's also very important. And it doesn't have to be anything huge. It can be 3 days a week for 30 minutes, walking, even in a small space, doing jumping jacks, listening to music and dancing. Things like this will be very, very important. And I think a third one I would say to add really is creativity. Creative expression is so vital for mental health. So listening to music, playing music, poetry, dance, any of these things to practice regularly is so important.
What about caregivers? How can they cope while taking care of their mentally ill relatives or dependents?
So this is a real serious issue because burnout and exhaustion is very real for caregivers and lack of support. The first thing is to know that it is necessary to and okay to ask for help. Some of us really don't ask for help and believe that we have to do it all. Some people are maybe listening to me and say, well, there's nobody that is helping, so that is nice. But where you can, to seek out that sort of help and support. It's important to find support from people who know what it's like to be a caretaker, because that will normalize some of the experiences that people have. So, you know, oh, it's not that you're going quote unquote crazy or whatever, your feelings are normal and they're valid. Finding time, even 5 minutes to step away from the caretaking role, and know for some people it's them and them alone, but even 5 minutes to step away from the caretaking role and do something for yourself, journal, listen to music, pray if you're a spiritual person, and develop a practice of that is very, very important.
And finally, Dr. Chambers, what solutions do you think the governments and institutions can put in place to help reduce the social risk factors of mental disorders?
Yes, so I'm glad that you mentioned government and other institutions, because it really relies on all of us, from the family to the school to the church to the government. Okay, so again, if we look at risk factors, things like ensuring or helping the population to find stable work, that is directly related to mental health. Depression is closely associated with unemployment, for example. So putting in work strategies to help people find regular employment, skills building, so that our young people have skills and so on, directly related to mental health. So that's very important. Providing a crime strategy. So yes, policing is important, but not only that, but looking at some of the underlying factors that's causing crime and helping to mitigate that, because that will reduce the urban violence and will reduce the likelihood of the development of post-traumatic stress disorder and complex PTSD and so on. We look at women and depression. You mentioned that, for example. So ensuring that women have livable wages. So we talk about the minimum wage, for example. So ensuring that the minimum wage is a livable wage, so that single households, female-headed households, that the women can earn enough to support and provide for their children, ensuring unions that provide maternity leave. All of these are related to mental health. Now, in terms of the school and the church, I think there's much that we can do to incorporate what we call trauma-informed policies. So schools having social workers, programs to help children with physical exercise and creativity, so on. Public health campaigns like what you're doing now, but ensuring that we destigmatize mental illness for the general population, for ourselves, and also for providers, to tell you the truth. Medical providers, that's very, very important also. Providing green spaces where people can actually go outdoors and commune. There's a lot of urbanization going on in Kingston and St. Andrew these days, and green spaces being cut down, but putting those things into place. So I could go on and on, but these are just some of the things.
Is there anything else you'd like to share, Dr. Chambers?
What would I say? I think that to ensure the mental health of our population, it really is a collective effort. A mentor of mine, Professor Hickling, would say it requires a certain amount of social re-engineering of the population, which is to understand who we are as people and our strengths. So there has been a negation of our culture. There has been a negation of the majority race in Jamaica, but when we can overcome those negations, and as Rastafari, I would say overstand who we are, that is actually integral to mental health. We don't always have to rely on our North Star, which is North America, to find answers. The answers are here, and there are many organizations who are doing really good work, and it's important to support that work.
Dr. Chambers, thank you for a very informative and interesting discussion. And to our viewers, thanks for watching.
Connect with us. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook at GetThePH.
And we'll close with our inspirational quote. Your mental health is a priority. Your happiness is an essential. Your self-care is a necessity.